"Happy birthday, Mom!" We wouldn't miss it for the world. That's what my daughter Patricia had said on the phone 3 days before, and I believed her, because a mother always wants to believe the daughter she raised. The chair stayed empty until the candles burned down to puddles of wax. 32 place settings, and not one single fork was ever lifted. I had spent $4,000 on a party for a family that couldn't spend 4 minutes walking through my front door. But I was not going to let that be the last thing I remembered about turning 70. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that I stood in my own dining room at 8 o'clock that night, in a blue dress I had bought specifically, because my late husband Walter always said blue brought out my eyes. And I looked at a room full of untouched food, and I made a decision that would change everything 6 months later, though I didn't know it at the time. I only knew that I was not going to let good food go to waste, and I was not going to let one more tear fall in front of people who weren't even there to see it. My name is Margaret Ellison, though the people who love me call me Maggie. And for 46 years, until cancer took him in the coldest February of my life, I was married to a man named Walter Ellison, who built a small hardware supply business from a single rented garage in 1979 into a company that, by the time he sold it 11 years before his death, was worth more than either of us ever imagined. A hardware business could be worth. We were not flashy people. Walter drove the same truck for 14 years. He wore the same brown leather work boots until the soles were held together with glue and stubbornness. I clipped coupons out of habit long after we no longer needed to, and I still remember the particular satisfaction of finding a 2-for-1 deal on canned tomatoes, even in the years when the number in our bank account no longer required it. That was simply who we were. We raised 3 children in a modest colonial house with a mortgage we paid off 11 years early, and we put every one of them through college without a single loan between them. And when Walter died, he left me comfortable in a way that most widows my age can only dream about. I tell you this not to boast, because there is nothing to boast about in money you didn't earn alone and can't take with you. I tell you this because you need to understand what was thrown away on the night of my 70th birthday, and you cannot understand the weight of what was thrown away if you don't first understand what I had built and what I had given, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, year after year, to 3 children who could not spare one Saturday evening for the woman who gave them everything. Let me tell you a little about the years before all of this, because I think it matters, and because for a long time, those years were the only story I told myself about my family. My son David is 44 now, a dentist with a practice in the next county over. I remember driving him to swim practice at 5 in the morning for 3 years straight because he wanted to make the varsity team, and I remember sitting in a cold parking lot with a thermos of coffee, grading nothing, doing nothing, simply being present in case he needed me, which he rarely did, but I wanted to be there regardless. I remember the year he decided, at 19, that he wanted to go to dental school instead of finishing the business degree Walter had quietly hoped he'd pursue. And I remember Walter's disappointment lasting exactly 4 days before he drove to the community college himself and picked up prerequisite course catalogs so David wouldn't have to do it alone. We paid for 4 years of dental school in full. No loans, no strings, because that was what parents did in our house. David married a woman named Renee 9 years ago, and in all that time, she has never once called me anything but Margaret. Never Mom, never anything with warmth in it. I told myself for years that this was simply a difference in personality, that some people are not naturally affectionate, and I made peace with it the way you make peace with weather you cannot change. My daughter Patricia is 41, an interior designer, twice divorced, currently living in a townhouse I helped her put a down payment on 4 years ago, $41,000 I never once asked her to repay. Patricia was, of all my children, the one who as a little girl used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms, who used to say, unprompted, "I love you more than ice cream, Mommy," which at 6 years old was the highest compliment she knew how to give. She grew into a striking, capable woman with sharp instincts for beauty and design, and I was proud of her, genuinely proud, even as I watched something in her harden over the years, some calculation creeping into decisions that used to be made from the heart. I paid for her first wedding in full. I helped her financially through both divorces, not because either man deserved my generosity, but because she was my daughter and she was hurting, and hurting daughters do not get billed for comfort. And my youngest, Christopher, 38, has never held a job longer than 16 months in his entire adult life and has borrowed more money from me over the past decade than I care to add up out loud, though I have added it up, quietly, in a notebook I keep in my nightstand drawer. $218,000. That is the number. I know it exactly because I wrote down every single check, every wire transfer, every "just this once, Mom, I promise," that turned into a pattern so familiar I could have recited his excuses in my sleep. Christopher was the baby, the one Walter and I probably softened on most, the one whose failures we kept explaining away with theories about timing, about the economy, about him simply finding his footing later than most. I loved him fiercely, the particular fierce love you reserve for the child who seems most fragile, and I think, looking back, that fierceness may have done him more harm than good. Walter used to say, gently, in the years before he got sick, that we were building him a floor instead of teaching him to stand. And I remember bristling at the comment then, defending Christopher the way mothers instinctively defend their youngest, though I have thought of that phrase often in the years since. And I believe now that Walter was right, and that I simply wasn't ready to hear it at the time. I think, too, of Walter's final year, because it tells you something about how each of my children behaves when something is actually required of them rather than simply offered to them. Walter was diagnosed in March, and by the following February, he was gone. 11 months in which our lives narrowed down to hospital waiting rooms and medication schedules and the particular exhaustion of watching a strong man grow smaller by the week. I remember being surprised, even then, by who showed up and who didn't. Christopher, for all his financial struggles, was the one who sat with his father through 3 separate chemotherapy sessions, reading him the sports section in a voice Walter said reminded him of his own father's voice. David came when he could, which was less often than I would have liked, always citing the demands of the practice, though I noticed he found time for a golf trip with college friends the same month Walter's diagnosis turned terminal. Patricia sent flowers. Beautiful ones, professionally arranged, the kind you'd expect from a woman with her eye for design, delivered to the house with a card that said, "Thinking of you both," though she visited in person only twice in those 11 months, both times for under an hour. I did not draw the conclusions then that I would draw later. Grief makes excuses easily, and I made plenty of them. Everyone processes illness differently, I told myself. Not everyone can bear to watch a parent decline. But looking back, I understand now that those 11 months were the first real test my children faced. The first moment that required something of them beyond attendance at a holiday dinner or a phone call on a Sunday. And the way each of them answered that test told me more than I was willing to hear at the time. For years, I told myself that this was simply what mothers did. You give, and you do not keep score, because love is not a ledger. But somewhere along the way, without my noticing the exact moment it happened, giving had stopped being love from their side and had become expectation. I had gone from being their mother to being their resource. And I did not fully understand the difference between those two things until the night 32 chairs sat empty around a table meant to celebrate 70 years of my life. The pattern did not begin with the birthday party. It began, if I am honest with myself, almost 2 years before, in small moments I noticed, and then talked myself out of noticing, the way you talk yourself out of a draft in an old house, because fixing it seems like more trouble than living with the cold. It began with Christopher stopping by less and less, except on the first of the month, when rent was due on an apartment he could not afford on his own. There was a particular tone his voice took on those calls, warm and eager in the first 10 seconds, before sliding, almost imperceptibly, into the real purpose of the call. "Hey, Ma, how are you feeling? How's the knee?" And then, within a breath or two, "So listen, I hate to ask, but..." I began to time those calls without meaning to. 11 seconds, on average, before the ask arrived. It began with Patricia's calls growing shorter, her visits growing rarer, always with some reason, always something about her business being busy, though I noticed she had time enough for weekend trips with friends that showed up, uninvited, in photographs online, women laughing on beaches in Tulum, in wine country, in cities I had once dreamed of visiting with Walter before his diagnosis made travel. Impossible. I did not begrudge her the trips. I begrudged the fact that a single Sunday dinner with her mother apparently required more logistical planning than a 4-day trip to Mexico. It began with David, who used to call me every Sunday evening without fail, the way his father had taught him to honor his mother, slowly reducing those calls to every other Sunday, and then to once a month. And then, in the final stretch before my birthday, to almost nothing at all, replaced by a text message that said only, "Hope you're doing well, Mom," as though I were a distant aunt he was obligated. To remember rather than the woman who had walked the hallway with him at 2 in the morning when he had colic as a baby, who had sat outside his dental school exams for 4 years praying he'd pass, who had never once, not once, failed to show up for him. There was a specific afternoon, a year before my birthday, that I think of now as an early warning I chose not to heed. I had asked David if he and the boys wanted to come for Sunday dinner. Nothing elaborate, just a roast, and the kind of easy conversation we used to have when he was younger. He said he'd check with Renee and call me back. He never called back. 3 days later, I saw on the boys' school website that they'd had a family game night that same Sunday, photographed and posted, smiling faces around a table that was not mine. I noticed these things the way you notice a slow leak. Not with alarm, not at first, but with a small, quiet unease that I kept explaining away. They're busy. They have their own lives now. This is simply what happens when children grow up. I told myself these things because the alternative explanation was too painful to sit with, and grief, even the slow grief of watching your children drift away while they are still alive, is something the heart resists accepting until it absolutely must. What I could not explain away, though, were the requests for money that never seemed to stop, even as the visits did. Christopher needed help with his car, a transmission repair that somehow cost $4,000 and was never actually completed, because 2 months later, he needed money for a different car entirely. Christopher needed first and last month's rent, twice in 18 months, for 2 different apartments, the first of which he'd been evicted from after falling behind, despite the help I'd already given. Christopher needed just a little something to get through a rough patch that never seemed to end. A rough patch that had, by my counting, lasted the better part of a decade. Patricia needed help staging a house she was flipping, needed a loan for new business cards and a website redesign, needed, at one point, $6,000 for what she called an investment opportunity that I never once heard mentioned again after I wired the money. No return, no explanation, no follow-up when I gently asked, months later, how the investment had turned out. Even David, steady, successful David, had come to me 18 months earlier asking for help with a down payment on a lake house, a request I had granted without hesitation, $60,000 transferred within the week, the way I had granted every request before it, because I did not yet understand that generosity, unchecked, does not build gratitude. It builds appetite. There was another moment, smaller than the casserole incident, but no less telling, that I think of often. It was a Saturday in late February, and I had asked Renee, well in advance, 3 weeks' notice, whether I might take my 2 grandsons to the county fair that comes through every spring. A tradition Walter and I had started with David himself when he was small. Funnel cakes and rickety Ferris wheels, and the particular joy of watching a child win a stuffed animal he'll forget about within a month. Renee said she'd check the calendar and get back to me. She never did. I called again a week later, and she told me, apologetically enough on the surface, that the boys had a lot going on that weekend, travel soccer and a birthday party for a classmate, and maybe next year would work better. I saw, 3 days after the fair had come and gone, photographs online of both boys at that very fair, cotton candy in hand, posted by another family entirely, friends of David and Renee's, tagged and smiling, on the exact Saturday I had asked for weeks in advance. I did not say anything about it. I told myself, as I told myself about so many things that year, that there was probably an explanation, that plans change, that I was reading too much into an ordinary scheduling conflict. But some quiet part of me had already begun keeping a different kind of ledger by then, one where I noted, without meaning to, how many of my requests were met with genuine effort, and how many were simply absorbed into a life that had stopped making room for me. The moment the pattern crystallized into something I could no longer explain away came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 4 months before my birthday. I had stopped by Patricia's townhouse to drop off a casserole, the kind of thing a mother does without thinking twice, and I let myself in with the key she had given me years before, calling out her name as I stepped through the door. The house smelled like the vanilla candles she always burned, and I remember noticing, absurdly, a new set of throw pillows on her couch, the kind that probably cost more than my entire grocery budget for a month, before I heard her voice from the kitchen, on the phone, and stopped in the hallway. She's 70 this year, Patricia was saying, laughing in a way that had no warmth in it at all. I mean, how much longer is she really going to be around to spend it? Might as well let her enjoy giving it to us now instead of us waiting for. And then she saw me standing there, casserole dish in my hands, and her face went the color of ash, and she hung up the phone so fast I heard it clatter against the counter. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could hear the refrigerator humming, and somewhere outside a lawnmower starting up, ordinary sounds for a moment that did not feel ordinary at all. I did not scream. I did not cry. Not there. Not in front of her. I set the casserole down on her counter, very gently, and I said, "I hope whoever that was enjoys the rest of their day." And I walked out and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my heart doing something I did not have a name for yet. Patricia called me twice that evening. I let both calls go to voicemail. I was not ready to hear whatever explanation she had prepared, and some part of me already understood that no explanation would actually undo what I had heard. That was the moment the decision began to take shape inside me, though it would be months before it became a plan, and longer still before it became action. I want to be honest with you about something. The decision was not born from anger. Not really, though anger was certainly present, sitting hot and heavy in my chest for days afterward. It was born from clarity. For the first time in years, I saw my children not as I wished them to be, but as they actually were. And once you see a thing clearly, you cannot unsee it, no matter how much you might wish to. I did not act rashly. That has never been my way. Not in business, not in marriage, not in grief, and certainly not in this. I have watched enough women my age make impulsive decisions out of hurt, only to regret them later, and I was determined not to become one of them. So instead of confronting my children, instead of demanding answers or explanations, I did something quieter. I began to watch. I began to listen. And I began, for the first time in my life, to keep my own counsel about what I knew. There was a night, about 2 weeks after the casserole incident, when I could not sleep, and I found myself standing in Walter's old study, a room I had mostly left untouched since his death, running my fingers over the spines of his business books, the ledgers he used to keep by hand even after the company could have afforded software for it. You always said a business only survives if you know exactly what's coming in and what's going out. I said out loud, to no one, to the empty room, to the memory of him. I think I forgot to apply that lesson to my own family. I sat in his old leather chair until nearly 3 a.m. that night, and when I finally went to bed, something in me had settled, quiet and resolved, even though I did not yet know exactly what shape that resolve would take. There is one person who has known the whole of me since Walter's funeral, when I stood at that graveside in a black coat that felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and she is not a blood relation, but she is family in every way that matters. Her name is Judith Okafor, and she has been my attorney for 11 years, ever since Walter's estate planning first brought us together. And somewhere in that decade, she stopped being simply the woman who managed my legal affairs and became the closest thing I have to a sister. Judith is 63, sharp as a tack, a widow herself, and the two of us had developed, over the years, a friendship built on honesty neither of us extended to many other people. Her own husband, a surgeon named Terrence, had died of a sudden heart attack 14 years earlier, leaving her with 2 grown daughters who, unlike my own children, had rallied around her in a way I know she still counts among her deepest blessings. I think that contrast, though she never once said it directly, informed the way she listened to me that day. She understood, in a way that only someone who has also stood at a graveside young enough to still have decades ahead of her can understand, exactly how much a person's family reveals about itself in the years surrounding a loss. I called Judith the week after the casserole incident and asked if she had time for lunch, and she must have heard something in my voice, because she cleared her entire afternoon without asking why. We met at a small Ethiopian restaurant we both loved, tucked into a strip mall that didn't look like much from the outside, the kind of place where the owner knew our order before we sat down. I told her everything. The phone call I'd overheard. The $218,000 to Christopher. The pattern of visits shrinking while requests for money grew. The way my grandchildren, David's 2 boys, had started calling me Grandma Margaret instead of just Grandma, as though even that small intimacy had been rationed by their parents. I told her about the lake house, the investment that vanished, the game night I hadn't been invited to. Judith listened the way she always listens, without interrupting, taking small notes on a legal pad she kept in her bag out of habit. And when I finished, she set down her fork and looked at me with the directness I had always trusted her for. "Margaret," she said, "I've watched you give to those 3 children for 11 years, and I have never once told you what to do with your own money, because it wasn't my place. But I am going to tell you something now, and I need you to really hear it. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to be more than a source of funds to people who share your blood. Being their mother does not obligate you to be their bank, and it certainly doesn't obligate you to be an inconvenience they schedule around." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. "I don't want to punish them, Judith," I said. "I'm not looking for revenge." "I know you're not," she said. "That's not who you are." But there's a difference between revenge and consequence, and you're allowed to let consequence happen, even when it comes from people you love. Especially then. You've spent your whole life being generous, Margaret. I've never once seen you be honest about what that generosity has cost you. Maybe it's time those are the same thing. That conversation planted something in me that grew over the following weeks, quietly, the way things grow best. I did not tell Judith yet what I was thinking of doing. I did not fully know myself. But I asked her, before we parted that day, to begin quietly reviewing my estate documents, just to see where things stood. I told myself, to be prudent. She agreed without pressing me further, because that is the kind of friend she has always been. The plan, when it finally came together, unfolded in 3 stages, and I want to walk you through each of them, because I think there is something instructive in how a woman my age, a woman who had never done anything more rebellious in her life than return a casserole dish to a stranger's porch when it clearly wasn't hers, learned to build a plan brick by brick, the way Walter used to build inventory. Shelves in that first garage of his, 1 board at a time, measuring twice before cutting once. The first stage was simply information. I began paying closer attention than I ever had before, not out of suspicion for its own sake, but because I finally understood that I could not make a wise decision about my children's futures, or about my own, without first knowing the truth of what was happening around me. I started noticing things I had let slide past me for years. I noticed that Renee had begun referring to my house in conversations she didn't know I could overhear at family gatherings that had grown rarer and rarer as, "The house will probably end up renovating." I noticed that Christopher had, without asking me, added himself as an authorized user on one of my department store credit cards years earlier and had never once removed himself. A fact I only discovered when I finally sat down one evening and read through statements I had been signing off on without truly reading for longer than I want to admit. There were charges on that card I did not recognize. Gas station purchases in a town Christopher had once lived in, but I had not visited in over a year. Small enough individually that they had never raised a flag, but adding up, month over month, to nearly $3,000 I had never once been told about. I noticed that Patricia had, in an unguarded moment at a family dinner 8 months prior, referred to my jewelry, specifically the sapphire ring Walter had given me on our 30th anniversary, as something she was planning to have reset one day, as though it were already understood to be hers. I remember the exact way she'd said it, casually, over dessert. "When that's mine, I think I'll have it reset into something more modern," and how I had laughed it off at the time, the way you laugh off a comment that stings more than you're willing to admit in the moment. There was one more piece of information from that first stage that I have not yet told you, and I think it belongs here, because it is perhaps the clearest evidence of all. In late May, I asked my accountant, a soft-spoken man named Harold, who had managed our books since before Walter sold the business, to pull together a simple summary of exactly how much money had passed from me to each of my 3 children over the previous decade. Not out of any plan yet, simply because I wanted the truth in front of me in black and white rather than scattered across memory and old. Bank statements. When Harold handed me the printed summary 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice, slowly, the way you read something you already suspect but have never actually confirmed. Christopher, $218,000, as I have already told you. Patricia, $136,000, once I added together the townhouse down payment, the wedding, both divorces, the vanished investment, and a dozen smaller amounts I had genuinely forgotten about until Harold's records reminded me. David, $91,000, mostly concentrated in dental school and the lake house down payment, smaller in total than his siblings, but not insignificant. $445,000 across 10 years, given freely, given happily even, without a single request for it back. And in that same decade, I could count on one hand the number of unprompted visits, the calls that came simply because someone wanted to hear my voice rather than needed something from my wallet. That imbalance, laid out in Harold's careful columns, was the thing that finally made the pattern impossible to explain away as simple busyness or the ordinary drift of adult children building their own lives. None of these things, alone, would have meant much. But together, they painted a picture I could no longer refuse to see. A picture of 3 adult children who had quietly begun dividing my life among themselves before I had even finished living it. The second stage of the plan was protection, and this is where Judith's expertise became essential. Over a series of quiet meetings that summer, meetings I did not mention to any of my children, we began the work of updating my estate. I want to be clear that I did not go into those meetings with malice in my heart. I went in with a simple desire to be fair to myself, for possibly the first time in my adult life. Judith helped me review every account, every asset, every piece of the financial life Walter and I had built together, and slowly, carefully, we began to reshape what would happen to it all when I was gone. I moved the house out of joint tenancy language that had grown outdated since Walter's death and placed it fully under my own control, in a trust that I alone could amend. I removed Christopher as an authorized user from every account he'd quietly attached himself to, a 15-minute phone call that felt absurdly like one of the harder things I had ever done. I consolidated accounts that had grown scattered and confusing over the years into something clean and clear, with Judith as the sole executor I trusted to carry out my wishes without interference. And I began, slowly, to think about what those wishes actually were, separate from the assumptions my children had clearly been carrying for years, assumptions about a division of assets they had apparently already begun sketching out among themselves. The third stage was the hardest, because it required patience. And patience has never come naturally to me, not even at 70, when you might think a lifetime of practice would have made it easier. The third stage was simply living my life as though nothing had changed. Continuing to answer Christopher's calls when he needed to borrow money, continuing to smile at family dinners when they happened, continuing to be, on the surface, the same accommodating mother I had always been, while underneath, the ground was shifting completely. I want to be honest that this stage exhausted me more than any of the others. There is a particular kind of loneliness in sitting across a table from your own children, laughing at their jokes, asking about their lives, while carrying a truth they do not know you carry. But I told myself, every time it grew difficult, that I owed myself this much time to be certain, before I let certainty become action. It was during this stage that the discovery happened, the one that turned quiet reshaping into absolute certainty. It was a Sunday in June, and I had gone to David's house to drop off a birthday gift for my younger grandson, and I arrived a few minutes early, before David had gotten home from the golf outing he'd mentioned on the phone. Renee let me in, distracted, phone in hand, and told me to make myself comfortable in the kitchen while she finished a call in the other room. I sat at their kitchen island, admiring, despite everything, the way the afternoon light came through their bay window and their voices carried, the way voices do in houses with open floor plans and thin walls. And I heard Renee talking to who I would later learn was Patricia. I just think we need to have a plan, Renee was saying, because David won't bring it up with her, and Christopher definitely won't, because God forbid he stop taking money long enough to think about the future. But realistically, Patricia, she's 70. The house alone is worth, what, $900,000? Plus whatever's left in investments. We should at least be on the same page about how that gets split, because I am not doing this again where everyone fights at the funeral like your cousins did. I sat very still on that kitchen stool, my hands folded in my lap, and I listened to my daughter-in-law discuss the division of my life's work with my daughter as though I were already a line item on a spreadsheet, as though the woman who had made David's wedding possible, who had paid for the caterer and the flowers and half the honeymoon because they'd been a little tight that year, no longer existed as a person with wishes of her own, only as an asset to be managed and eventually distributed. I heard Patricia's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, respond, "Well, David's the executor, right? Or is it still that lawyer of hers?" And Renee say, with a note of irritation, It's still the lawyer. I keep telling David he should talk to her about maybe putting one of us in charge instead, someone in the actual family. But you know how he gets about bringing up anything with her. I did not confront her. I want you to understand why, because I know some of you listening might think I should have stood up right then, walked into that room, and said what needed to be said. But I have learned something in 70 years that I think is worth passing along. The moment you reveal what you know, you lose the ability to learn anything further. I needed to know more. I needed to understand the full shape of what my children believed about me, about my money, about my worth to them, before I decided what to do with that knowledge. So I sat, and I listened a little longer, and I heard Patricia's voice say something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Honestly, the party planning is kind of a waste of time if you think about it. It's not like she's going to remember who showed up and who didn't in 5 years. Let's just send a nice gift and call it good. Save the actual visit for when it matters. Save the actual visit for when it matters. As though my 70th birthday, a milestone most people are grateful to reach at all, was not a moment that mattered. As though I was a bill to be paid at the least inconvenient time rather than a mother whose face lit up every single time one of her children walked through the door. I left David's house before he ever got home from golf, gift left on the counter with a note that simply said, "For the birthday boy, love Grandma." And I drove home in a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat over the road noise. That was the day I stopped hoping the party would be different. I already knew, weeks before it happened, that no one was truly coming, not in the way that mattered, even if a few of them showed up out of obligation for an hour. And I was right, though even I did not expect the totality of the emptiness that awaited me that August evening, 32 chairs, and not a single one filled. One more discovery belongs in this part of the story because it was the final piece that turned my resolve from firm to unshakable. In early July, about 2 weeks after the conversation I'd overheard at David's house, I was helping Patricia carry boxes into her car after she'd stopped by, briefly, to pick up a set of serving platters she wanted to borrow for a client's open house. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was out at the car, and I was not looking to pry. I want to be clear about that, but the screen lit up with a message preview visible from where I stood. A group text thread labeled simply "Fam," and the preview, from Christopher, read, "Lol, whatever. As long as I don't get stuck with the china, none of us even use that stuff." Below it, another message, from Patricia herself, sent minutes earlier, apparently continuing a conversation that had clearly been going on for some time. "I already told you guys I want the sapphire ring. That's not up for discussion. David can have Dad's watch collection since he's the only one who'll actually wear any of it. I did not open the thread. I did not need to." I simply set the platters down on the counter, walked back outside, wished Patricia a good afternoon, and drove myself home, where I sat in my car in my own driveway for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside. There is a particular kind of pain in learning that your children have been quietly dividing your belongings, not after your death, but while you were still very much alive, still cooking dinner, still gardening, still very much a person with plans of her own. And I sat with that pain until it hardened, the way pain sometimes does, into something closer to resolve. The counter move, the thing that put me ahead of what I already sensed was coming, happened in the weeks immediately following that overheard conversation. I went back to Judith, this time with total resolve, where before there had only been careful consideration, and I told her I was ready to finalize everything, completely, without further delay. We met at her office on a Thursday evening in July, the summer light still golden outside her window at 7 o'clock, and she laid out the final documents across her conference table with the same careful precision Walter used to lay out blueprints for a new warehouse addition. "I want to walk you through every page of this," she said, "because I need you to be completely certain, Margaret. Once this is signed, it's signed. I don't want you doing this out of anger you might not still feel in a year." "It's not anger, Judith," I told her, and I meant it. "It's clarity. There's a difference, and I finally understand what it is." We went through it line by line. The house, the investment accounts, the modest bequests to each of my children, chosen carefully. Not out of spite, but as an acknowledgement that they were still, and would always be, my children, even if they were no longer the people I could trust with the whole of what Walter and I had built. And then the largest provision, the one that had been forming in my mind for months, but that I said out loud, in full, for the first time that evening, the bulk of the estate to Carmen. I want to be precise about what I did, because I think precision matters in a story like this one. I did not disinherit my children out of spite, and I did not do it impulsively. What I did was this. I restructured my estate so that the bulk of what Walter and I built together, the house, the investment accounts, the majority of the liquid assets that remained after a lifetime of careful saving, would go to Carmen Reyes in recognition of 9 years of genuine, unpaid, unrequested loyalty and love. I left each of my 3 children a modest sum, $25,000 apiece, enough to acknowledge that they were still my children, that I still loved them, even in my clarity about who they had become, but not enough to reward a decade of treating me as a resource rather than a mother. And I established a smaller trust, separate from the rest, to fund Carmen's daughter's college education in full, something Carmen had never once asked me for, though I had watched her worry over the cost of it for years, counting change for textbooks the way I used to count coupons. Judith looked at me carefully across the table as we finished signing the final pages. You understand what this means, Margaret. When they find out, and they will find out, this is going to break something in your family that may not be repairable. Something already broke, Judith, I told her. I'm just finally being honest about it instead of pretending the crack isn't there. Before all of this, though, before the papers were even signed, there was one evening I need to tell you about, because it is the truest part of this entire story, and because I think it is the reason I found the courage to do what I eventually did. There is one person who remained a constant through all of this, so constant that I am ashamed to admit, nearly stopped truly seeing her, the way you stop seeing a painting that has hung on your wall for so many years it becomes part of the wall itself. Her name is Carmen Reyes, and she has worked in my home for 9 years, since shortly after Walter passed, when my daughter-in-law at the time, David's first wife, actually, before Renee, suggested I might need a little help managing a house too large for one person to keep up alone. Carmen was 29 when she started with me, a widow herself, having lost her husband to a construction accident 2 years before, raising a daughter alone on wages that never seemed to stretch quite far enough. She came into my home twice a week at first, then 3 times. Then, as our lives quietly wove together in the way that happens when 2 people spend enough hours in the same rooms, she simply became a fixture of my days. Carmen has never asked me for money that wasn't earned through her labor. In 9 years, she has never once been late paying back the small advances I occasionally offered her against upcoming pay when her daughter needed something for school. She has never missed a single one of my birthdays, not with a gift, necessarily, because I know money is tighter for her than she ever lets on, but with her presence, with a homemade tres leches cake she knows is my favorite, with an afternoon spent simply sitting with me on the back porch, listening to stories about Walter that my own children had heard so many times they'd stopped asking to hear them again. I remember one particular afternoon, 2 years back, when I had a bad flu, and Carmen came on her day off, unpaid, uninvited, simply because she'd heard from a mutual friend that I hadn't been seen at the grocery store in a week, and she sat with me for 6 hours, making soup, changing the sheets on my bed, refusing every offer of extra pay with a firmness that surprised me at the time and that I understand completely now. On the night of my 70th birthday, as the clock crept past 8 and the driveway remained empty of every car except my own and Carmen's old sedan, it was Carmen who sat beside me at that long table meant for 32. Carmen, who did not once check her phone or glance toward the door the way I kept doing despite myself. Carmen, who finally reached over, took my hand in both of hers and said, "Doña Margaret, they are missing something beautiful tonight, and that is their loss, not yours. Let's eat. This food should not go to waste, and neither should this night." We did not have a sad dinner. In the end, though I will admit the first hour was heavy with a grief I had not expected to feel so sharply. But Carmen told me stories about her own mother, back in Guadalajara, about the birthday parties of her childhood, small and loud and full of cousins she hadn't seen in years, about a particular quinceañera where her uncle had accidentally set the piñata on fire trying to light the candles nearby, a story that had me laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in weeks. Slowly, the evening turned from something painful into something I still think of, oddly, as one of the best nights of my life, because it was the night I finally understood, with total clarity, who had actually been present for me all along. Near the end of the night, After we had packed up nearly 30 untouched trays of food, ready for me to drive them to the shelter downtown the following morning, exactly as I'd resolved to do the moment I realized no one was coming, Carmen said something I have thought about every day since. "You gave them a beautiful table, Doña Margaret. What they did with the invitation is on them. But I want you to know, whatever happens with your family, you are not alone in this world. You have never been alone. Not really. Not since I've known you." I did not tell her that night what those words would come to mean. I did not tell her about Judith, or the trust documents forming in my mind, or the growing certainty settling into my chest like a stone finally reaching the bottom of a lake. I simply squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you, Carmen. I mean that more than you know." The following morning, I loaded 31 trays of untouched party food into the back of my car, food that had been prepared for a family who never came, and I drove it to Hope Harbor, the shelter 3 miles from my house that I had donated to quietly for years without ever mentioning it to my children, because it had never occurred to me that generosity needed an audience to matter. The director, a tired but kind woman named Rosalind, met me at the loading dock, and when I explained where the food had come from, she did not offer pity, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. She simply said, "Well, their loss is going to be about 40 families' gain tonight," and helped me carry the trays inside. And I watched, through the propped open kitchen door, as a young mother with 2 small children began setting out the very same trays that had been meant for my own children. And I felt something in my chest ease, just slightly, at the sight of it. That week, something inside me finished settling into place. And that settling, that quiet clarity, carried me through the summer, through the overheard conversation at David's house, through the final documents signed in Judith's office, and into the 6 months that followed, months I lived as though nothing had changed, though everything had. I told no one, not even Carmen, what I had done. I continued living exactly as I had before, answering Christopher's calls, sending birthday cards to my grandchildren, attending the handful of family gatherings that still occasionally happened, holidays mostly, where my children performed warmth for an hour or two before disappearing back into their own lives. I did not do this out of dishonesty. I did it because I had decided that the truth would be revealed in its own time, in its own way, and that time was not mine to rush. 6 months passed. I will not pretend those 6 months were easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had done the right thing, if somewhere underneath the neglect there was still love that simply didn't know how to express itself, if I was being too harsh, too final, too much like the bitter old women I had always sworn I would never become. I remember one particular night in October, sitting alone at that same kitchen table where I'd once done homework with 3 small children who no longer seemed to remember whose hands had held theirs through every fever, every heartbreak, every first day of school, wondering whether I should call Judith and ask her to soften the provisions, split things more evenly, give my children one more chance to prove me wrong. But then I would remember Patricia's voice through that phone, calculating the worth of my house down to the dollar, and Renee's certainty that my death was simply a matter of scheduling, and the resolve would settle back into place, steady as a keel. In late January, 7 weeks after my 71st birthday, which passed, I should mention, with slightly more attendance than my 70th, though still without any real warmth in it, my heart simply stopped one evening while I was reading in bed. It was quick. The doctors told my children later, painless, they believed, a peaceful end for a woman who had lived, on the whole, a peaceful and purposeful life. I do not tell you this part of the story to be morbid. I tell you because it is the truth of how this particular chapter closed, and because I want you to understand that everything I had built, every careful decision, every quiet conversation with Judith, was waiting exactly where I had left it when the day finally came. The will reading took place on a gray Tuesday in Judith's office, 3 weeks after the funeral. A funeral that I am told was well attended, full of flowers and kind words from people who had known Walter and me for decades, and full, too, of a strange formality between my children that anyone who knew our family well might have noticed, a stiffness where warmth used to be. My 3 children sat together on one side of Judith's long conference table, David in his good suit, Patricia in black that looked more fashionable than mournful, Christopher fidgeting the way he had fidgeted through every serious conversation since he was a boy. Renee sat beside David, and I understand she brought a legal pad of her own, which tells you something about what she expected to happen in that room. Carmen was not present for the reading itself, invited separately, quietly, by Judith, to come by the office an hour after my children had left, because Judith and I had discussed, in one of our final meetings, that it would be kinder to everyone, Carmen especially, if she did not have to sit across a table from 3 grieving, entitled adults while learning that the woman who had employed her had, also, in the end, chosen her. Judith told me everything about that room afterward, in the kind of detail only a lawyer who has represented someone with total devotion can provide, and I have thought about her account so many times since that I feel almost as though I were there myself, watching from some quiet corner of the ceiling. She began, as she always does, methodically, reading through the preliminary language of the trust, the acknowledgments, the small personal bequests I had left, a set of Walter's tools to David, who had loved working alongside his father in the garage as a boy before he'd grown too busy for such things, my grandmother's china to Patricia, who had once, decades ago, before ambition hardened something in her, expressed genuine love for those delicate blue and white plates, and to Christopher, my late husband's old truck, still running, still reliable, a gift I hoped, perhaps foolishly, might remind him of the kind of steady, unglamorous dependability his father had modeled and that Christopher had never quite managed to find in himself. Then Judith read the financial provisions, and this, my children later admitted to each other in ways that eventually made their way back to me through Carmen, who heard it secondhand from a mutual acquaintance, was the moment the air in the room changed entirely. To each of my children, David Ellison, Patricia Ellison Whitmore, and Christopher Ellison, I leave the sum of $25,000, along with my enduring love and the hope that they will reflect honestly on the years leading up to this moment. Judith told me Patricia's face went white, the polish draining out of it in real time. David simply stared at the table, saying nothing, the way he had always retreated into silence rather than confrontation, even as a boy, his jaw working but no words coming out. Christopher, apparently, let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh that has no humor in it at all, and said, "That's it? That has to be a mistake." "There is no mistake," Judith told him, and continued reading. "The remainder of my estate, including my home, all investment accounts, and remaining liquid assets, valued in total at approximately $1.1 million, I leave in its entirety to Carmen Elena Reyes in recognition of 9 years of genuine devotion, honesty, and love that asked for nothing in return. Additionally, I have established a separate educational trust in the amount of $80,000 for the benefit of Carmen's daughter, Sophia Reyes, to be used exclusively for the cost of her college education." Judith said the silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute, which in a room like that, she told me, feels like an hour. Renee was the first to speak, and her voice, Judith said, had lost every ounce of the polish it usually carried. "This is insane. This woman worked here. She's the housekeeper. There has to be grounds to contest this. Undue influence, diminished capacity, something." "I can assure you," Judith told her, with the calm precision I had always admired in her, that Margaret was of entirely sound mind when these documents were drafted, revised, and finalized over a period of several months, with extensive documentation, multiple independent witnesses, including her longtime physician, and, frankly, more clarity about her own wishes than I have seen from most of my clients in 22 years of practice. "I would strongly caution against pursuing a contest you will not win, and which will only cost you the $25,000 you were left, along with whatever remains of your relationships with each other, in legal fees." Renee did not let it go easily. Judith told me she pressed further, her voice climbing in volume in a way that made the receptionist outside eventually knock, gently, to ask if everything was all right. "This doesn't make any sense," Renee said. "David is her son. Her actual blood. You're telling me some woman she paid to clean her toilets gets the house, and we get $25,000? That's insulting." "That's actually insulting." "I understand this is difficult to hear," Judith said, and I am told her voice never once lost its evenness. "But I'd encourage you to consider that Margaret's decisions were not made in a vacuum. They were made after a great deal of reflection on the actual relationships in her life, as she experienced them. I am not able to share the specifics of those reflections, but I can tell you they were extensive, and they were entirely her own. David finally spoke then, for the first time since the reading had begun, his voice quieter than his wife's had been. "Did she say anything? Before, did she say why? She said quite a bit to me, over many months, Judith told him. Some of it I'm not at liberty to share, out of respect for her privacy even now. But I will tell you this much, because I think she would want you to hear it. She loved being your mother. She talked about all three of you constantly, your whole lives, right up until the end. What she stopped believing, somewhere along the way, was that the feeling was still mutual in the way it once had been. The reckoning that followed, once the initial shock passed, did not fall evenly across my three children, and I think that unevenness matters, because it tells you something true about who each of them had become. Renee, and to some degree David alongside her, pushed the hardest against what I had done. In the weeks that followed the reading, Renee contacted no fewer than 3 different attorneys asking about grounds to contest the will, all of whom, Judith later learned, declined to take the case once they reviewed the extensive documentation Judith had prepared over the preceding months. David, for his part, did not push quite as hard as his wife, but he did not push back against her either, and there is a particular kind of failure, I think, in a son who watches his wife try to strip away his mother's final wishes and says nothing to stop her. Judith told me that in one of their final conversations, David asked, almost pleadingly, "Isn't there anything we can do? This can't be legal, can it?" And when Judith explained, patiently, for what must have been the 4th or 5th time, that it was entirely legal and entirely final, he simply nodded and left without another word. Patricia was the one who broke first, not into anger, but into a kind of quiet, horrified understanding. "The birthday party," she said, so quietly Judith almost missed it. "This is about the birthday party, isn't it?" "I couldn't speak to your mother's specific reasoning," Judith said, though of course she could have, and chose the discretion I would have wanted her to choose. "I can only tell you what the documents say, and that they reflect her wishes exactly as she expressed them to me over many months of careful consideration." Patricia did not pursue a legal contest, unlike Renee. Instead, I am told, she went home that night and sat alone in the townhouse I had helped her afford, and called no one, and did not post anything online for nearly 3 weeks, an absence her friends apparently noticed and commented on. Whatever happened in her heart during those 3 weeks, I will never fully know. But when she finally did reach out to Carmen, months later, it was not with anger. It was with a single text message, which Carmen showed me, in a manner of speaking, by telling me about it during one of our visits after everything had settled. "I don't know if this means anything, but I hope you take good care of her house. She loved that house more than any of us understood, I think." Christopher, of all my children, was the one who asked the hardest question in that conference room, the one that Judith later told me she thought about for a long time afterward. Did she hate us? Is that what this is? She hated us at the end? And Judith, who had known me for 11 years, who had sat with me through the darkest days after Walter's death and the quiet, clarifying days of that final summer, told him something I am grateful she chose to say, because I believe it was true, and I believe he needed to hear it, even if he wasn't ready to accept it yet. "No," she said, "I don't believe your mother hated any of you. I believe she loved you very much, for your entire lives, more than most parents I have ever met. I think what changed was that she finally understood the difference between being loved and being useful, and she decided, after 70 years, that she deserved to know which one she actually was to the people around her." There was a family gathering, of sorts, about 4 months after the reading, though I use the word gathering loosely, since it was really only Patricia and Christopher. David having declined to attend, meeting at a diner near the old house to, as Patricia later described it to Carmen, try to figure out how to actually talk to each other again without Mom in the room to smooth everything over. Carmen heard about that meeting secondhand, through a chain of mutual acquaintances that still occasionally connected her to my children's lives. And what she heard was that the two of them sat for nearly 3 hours, working through a decade of resentments that had apparently been simmering between them long before I ever entered the picture. Old sibling grievances about who Walter had favored, who had been forced to grow up faster, who had gotten away with more. Whatever came of that conversation, I understand it did not fully repair things between them, but it apparently opened a door that had been closed for a long time, and Christopher, at least, began calling Patricia more regularly afterward, not to ask for money, since there was considerably less of it to ask for by then, but simply to talk. David's path was quieter and, I think, lonelier. Carmen told me that nearly a year after the reading, she ran into him at the hardware store, of all places, the very kind of store his father had built an empire out of, and he had asked her, awkwardly, whether she might be willing to have coffee sometime, just to talk. She agreed, and they met the following week, and David spent most of the hour, she said, asking questions about me that he had apparently never thought to ask while I was alive. What did I do during my afternoons? What music did I still listen to? Whether I had been lonely in that big house by myself? Carmen answered every question honestly, she told me, including the ones that were hardest for him to hear, and at the end of the conversation, he thanked her, quietly, and said, I think I spent so many years assuming she'd always just be there that I never actually got to know who she was once she wasn't only my mother anymore. Renee, Carmen mentioned, was not present at that coffee, and has not, to Carmen's knowledge, reached out to her at all in the time since. Christopher, unlike his siblings, actually kept the truck. He drives it still, I am told, and has, in the year since, taken a job at a hardware supply company 2 towns over, entry-level, unglamorous, the kind of steady work his father once built an entire company around. Whether that is coincidence or something closer to a lesson finally learned, I cannot say for certain. But Carmen tells me she saw him once, months later, at a gas station, and he asked, quietly, almost shyly, whether Carmen and Sophia were doing all right, and when she said yes, he simply nodded and said, good. She would have wanted that before driving off in his father's old truck. An hour after my children left that conference room, Carmen arrived, still in the plain cardigan she wore to clean other people's houses, her hands twisting nervously in her lap when Judith explained what had been decided, what I had chosen, what waited for her and for Sophia, because of 9 years spent simply, quietly, showing up with love that never once had a price tag attached to it. Judith told me that Carmen cried, not with joy exactly, not at first, but with something closer to grief, because she said, through her tears, she was my friend. I would have given anything just to have her back. Not the house, not any of it. Just her. Judith said, Carmen sat in that office for nearly an hour afterward, simply talking about me, about the 9 years we'd shared, about small things, the way I liked my coffee, the songs I used to hum while gardening, the stories about Walter I never tired of telling, as though she needed to say them out loud to someone who would understand what had actually been lost. That, I think, more than the money, more than the house, more than any of the numbers in that trust document, is the truest answer to the question my children asked in that room. Did she hate us? No. But love, real love, is not proven by blood, and it is not owed automatically simply because a name appears on a birth certificate. Love is proven in the showing up. It is proven in the casseroles brought without being asked, in the hands held across a table set for 32 when only 2 people came, in the years of quiet loyalty that never once expected a reward and received one anyway. Not because it was earned in some transactional sense, but because it was finally, simply seen. I think often about what I would say to each of my children now if I could sit across from them one more time, not in anger, but in the honest way I wish I had learned to speak to them years before it all came to this. To David, I would say, your silence was its own kind of absence, and a son who loves his mother learns to fill the silence, not hide in it, and I hope one day you find the courage to speak up for the people who deserve your voice before it's too late for them too. To Patricia, I would say, the things you calculate the worth of are rarely the things that carry the most value, and I hope one day you learn the difference before it costs you something you cannot get back, the way it cost you this. To Christopher, I would say, I gave you $218,000 over 10 years, but I never once got the thing I actually wanted from you, which was simply your time, freely given, and I would have traded every dollar of it for a single Sunday afternoon spent together, no requests attached, and I am glad, more than you know, that you finally found your own steady ground. I want to tell you one more thing before I close this story, because I think it matters more than almost anything else I've told you. Sophia, Carmen's daughter, was 19 when I died, in her first year at the community college, working nights at a pharmacy to help cover the gap between what financial aid provided and what tuition actually cost. Carmen told me, months later, that when she sat Sophia down at their kitchen table and explained what the trust meant, that 4 years of school, any school she wanted, anywhere in the country, were now fully paid for, Sophia did not celebrate right away. She cried instead for a long time, and when she finally spoke, she said, "I didn't even get to say thank you properly." I always meant to write her a real letter, and I kept putting it off because I thought there'd be more time. Carmen told me she said to her daughter what I believe I would have said myself if I'd had the chance. "Mija, the thank you was never the point. She didn't do this because she wanted gratitude. She did it because she wanted you to have a chance she never got to see the end of herself." Sophia is studying nursing now, I'm told, in a program she chose entirely on her own, without a single dollar of debt weighing on her shoulders. And Carmen says she keeps a photograph of the two of us, taken at a 4th of July barbecue years back, on her desk in her dorm room, a small, quiet reminder of a woman she barely knew, but who changed the entire shape of her future regardless. Carmen herself did not leave my house empty, in the way some might expect a woman suddenly given over $1 million to do. She stayed, actually, for the better part of a year, unable to bring herself to sell it right away, tending the garden I had kept for decades, sitting some evenings on the same back porch where she used to bring me trees, Leche's cake, before finally deciding, with Judith's gentle guidance, to sell the house to a young family with 3 children who reminded her, she said, of the noise and life the place deserved to hold again. She used a portion of what remained to open a small cleaning and home care business of her own, employing 4 other women in situations not unlike the one she'd once been in herself, women who needed steady, dignified work and someone willing to give it to them. She named the business simply Margaret's House, and when I first heard that, secondhand, through the same chain of mutual acquaintances that carried most of this story back to me, I confess it is the detail that moved me most of all. I think, too, about the version of myself who stood in that dining room at 70 years old, staring at 32 empty chairs, believing in that moment that the emptiness in front of me was the whole of the story. It was not. It was only the moment the old story ended, so that a truer one could begin.